Government can force state and local governments to do things, but they can't force them to do those things well.
Chad Aldeman, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Principal at Bellwether Education Partners. We are former colleagues. I hope we're longtime friends. You can decide after this interview if that's actually true. So you are the perfect person, if you don't mind my saying so, to continue this conversation I've been having about this ongoing discussion of what is the right balance of power between the federal government and state governments when it comes to K-12 education. So for our viewers, you worked at the U.S. Department of Education under the Obama administration, but you also just recently finished editing a big study of state plans under this new federal law, ESSA. So you can speak both from the perspective of Washington, D.C., but also what states are doing, and we're going to get there in a minute. But to sort of begin the level setting here is we're actually at AEI today on the same day that there was an event on the Bush-Obama era of education. So for folks who don't follow this very closely, the idea is that although President Bush and President Obama are very different, there's an argument that they both wanted a more muscular role for Uncle Sam in our schools, and they did so over 16 years. So let's actually just start there. As you look back on the Bush-Obama era, what do you think of the federal government's role? How do we describe it?
There's definitely a concentration of power, and there was much more federal government role in education policy writ large than there had been prior. I think one of my biggest takeaways from this morning was the power and effectiveness of some of the competitive grants that we saw. Like the Teacher Incentive Fund was designed under the Bush administration to give essentially performance pay to teachers, and bonuses is the way it was originally designed. The Obama administration, it was sort of political, but the Obama administration still took that up and pushed it forward and got some good results out of it. Similarly with the charter school program, I think of those as some of the bigger successes of this era of competitive grants, people who and organizations that actually wanted to do something did good things with it. I think some of the federal requirements that we might talk about had less positive effects.
Well, let's actually just drill in for a second on this nature of competitive grants, because in the broadest terms, the U.S. Department of Education have what we call formula grants, just hand out money to states and districts based on the number of students you have, essentially. Competitive grants are a little bit different, and during the Bush-Obama era, there was a view, okay, the federal government will put some money on the table and say, we think that this ought to get done, we're not going to force you to do it, but if you want some money, you can try it out. So TIF, the Teacher Incentive Fund, was one, charter school grant program, but also Race to the Top. Some people would argue, some people would say it pushed too hard, or it was a push instead of just a nudge, but also it was money on the table. So what do you think of Race to the Top now in hindsight?
In hindsight, so I wrote this piece looking back at the teacher eval, and it was focused on the teacher evaluation context. And in that sense, teacher evaluation was one big part of Race to the Top. It got a lot of the outsized attention on it. I sort of feel like Race to the Top was a little too muddy. It tried to do too many things. There were 19 different priorities, ranging from everything from standards to teacher evaluation to school turnarounds to data. And I think it was a good opportunity. I think the money was a good idea at the time. It was during the recession. It was a chance to leverage what was a good amount of money from the federal government, but not a lot from the states and districts to get them to do new things that they hadn't been doing. I just think it was probably too muddy, too comprehensive. I think it would have been better if it had been split up and say, here's a pot for teachers, here's a pot for standards, and think about those things differently. Okay,
well, let's come back to teacher eval in just 1 second, but just your interpretation of the positives. So competitive grant programs, the federal government setting a goal, providing money to incentivize states to do things. Do you think that probably worked out well? One thing we heard today, and that I think a lot of people on the left and right would say one of the benefits of NCLB, the No Child Left Behind Act, the Bush administration 0102, was that it forced states and then force districts to test in grades 3 through 8 in reading and math, and then not only provide the data, but disaggregate the data. So it was definitely a heavy hand here, but a lot of people now are saying, thank goodness for that, because 15, 16, 17 years later, we have lots of data on how all of our kids are doing. So would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the clear wins for me from No Child Left Behind, and that sort of era is the data that we have, and both the availability of the data linkages to other sorts of systems, not just assessments, but now linking it to teachers, linking it to long-term outcomes, pre-K or higher ed, all those types of things. And then being able to disaggregate it, looking at different populations of students.
Okay, so if I'm constructing a narrative here, we could say, all right, generally a benefit of this era is the federal government incentivized states. States could do some things if they wanted to do it and get some money for it. They were nudged to provide more data, so the public knew more, so they would be incentivized to reform, all good stuff. Then we get to some things like teacher evaluation, where it wasn't so much encouragement anymore. It felt like the federal government was saying, here's how you need to evaluate your teachers using data in this way, and here's how your laws and regulations need to change. So how do you start to draw the line between some of these things that are good and when this starts to get too heavy-handed?
I guess, so we're in AEI, the person that has changed my thinking on this, and both before and after my term in government service, was Rick Hess. Talks about government can force state and local governments to do things, but they can't force them to do those things well. And I attribute that to Rick Hess and repetition and all the stuff that he's written over time. And also my time in government service has shown me that
there's wisdom in that, isn't there?
There is wisdom in that. And so I take it the same. Like in CLB, there's some things that were worth doing just to do to like raise the floor of some things. And so that there are some places where that's still necessary. But to try to leverage system-wide improvements, like that just can't happen from the federal government. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's about finding ways to incentivize people who want to do good things to do those things. And that's where my head is at this point.
So where then do you put something like Common Core on that? Is it on the boundary? Is it more the forcing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think of it more as an investment, as a incentive to encourage it. So there are some national benefits if more places use common standards, because then curriculum makers can have a better market than just going after 50 states. So there's some national incentives, but I don't think it should be forced or mandated. I think sort of in the Every Student Succeeds Act requires that states have high quality standards, and it leaves it up to the states to determine what that means and working with their own higher education institutions.
Okay, so whether we like all of, part of, none of the Bush-Obama era, I think all of us have to recognize that it caused maybe, or at least nudged us towards the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was Congress in 2015, at the very end of 2015, passing a reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which is a reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, essentially saying, Uncle Sam, thanks for your work, but back up a little bit. We're going to give states a whole lot more authority in the years ahead. And that was a reaction to states being frustrated, being told what to do across all these domains. So let's just pause there for a second. You had some misgivings about ESSA when it was passed. So if we can think about the 2015, 2016 Chad, what were your concerns about it then?
So my concerns were that it gave probably too much flexibility to the states. It didn't leave much federal role to ensure that states were putting forth high quality plans.
Okay, can I pause there? Because someone might say, well, wait, if we know that the Bush-Obama era was too much federal pushing, why would we not trust states? Aren't they going to do the right thing?
So even under No Child Left Behind, there was wide variance in how states got outcomes. And so some states did pretty well, some states did not do very well. And that was even under No Child Left Behind, which was more of a rules-based national system. There's still lots of choices within that, and states did other things that produced different results. So my hunch was that we would see that under ESSA as well, only magnified even more. So some states would take that flexibility and do good things with it. Some states would take that flexibility and not do much with it. So the question for me was always, it's still federal dollars. The federal government still thinks there's some value in sending that money out to states, particularly for low-income kids. And so I still think the federal government has some oversight role in making sure that those plans are high quality. And you and I have written a paper, we've grappled on this.
I was about to make a joke about this.
what the right lever is. I think no one, well, I shouldn't say this. Lots of people agree that we can't have a rules-based system like No Child Left Behind, like setting the rules for everybody. But is there a way to say there's some discretion at the federal government level to set some parameters for quality, whether that's through an informal peer review process, some sort of secretarial authority? I think the secretarial authority under ESSA is very limited, and I worry that it's not giving the current administration enough of a tool to say, no, you need some more thinking on this plan. You need to keep working on this if you want to get federal dollars.
So if anyone is interested, I think it was 2014 or 2015, we wrote this pretty long paper, Pax Americana. I think that, let's just say it wasn't widely read or it wasn't widely adopted yet.
Our timing was terrible.
Our timing was bad, but what we were doing was in real time trying to wrestle with this fundamental question. If we know that the No Child Left Behind era happened for a reason, but we also know that we were pushing towards ESSA for a reason, that means that we have to somehow find this area between nudging states, given the billions of dollars the federal government sends them, nudging them to make sure that we're getting the results we want, but without being too heavy-handed. So that leads to this next question, which is, okay, so you conceptually had some questions about ESSA back in 2015, 2016, but now we don't have to speculate as much anymore. We're 2 years into it, and states have produced these plans, which states had to create accountability plans, systems underneath the new federal law, meeting some criteria, but free largely to go their own ways in a couple different areas. And so you and some colleagues took a look at all of these plans and you assessed them. And so, like I said, it's not speculation anymore. You can actually render some, let's just say, initial judgment. So what did you guys find?
So looking across all the plans, we said they were uncreative, largely unfinished, unambitious. We felt like a lot of things were recycled from prior efforts, prior plans, or a lot of it was incomplete. So either on the indicator level, states haven't fully defined how they're going to measure something. They haven't defined how they're going to take the indicators and roll them up to a system for identification purposes. And then they haven't always explicitly said what they're going to do for low-performing schools. Both like the interventions that those schools might have to pursue, as well as any funding or resources that might be directed to them. Mm-hmm. There's a big pot of money in ESSA that says every state sets aside 7% of their Title I funds, which nationally is about $1 billion. We looked and said, and states have lots of discretion about how they spend that money, whether it's a formula or a competition, whether they want to embed some initiatives or other sorts of priorities within that. We counted in this last round, there were 34 states, state plans, only 12 states mentioned that money, and most of them were in a very small paragraph to say, it's going to be a formula, it's going to be competition, but not much depth or detail about what that's going to look like.
So I don't want to put words into your mouth, but do you feel like some of your concerns from 2015 are being realized, that we might be seeing some regression, that Uncle Sam backed up and now states might not be taking some of these things as seriously?
I think that's fair at this point. I mean, it's still early. It's been 2 years, so you could say that's a long time. You could say that's a short time. In federal or state bureaucracy land, it's probably not that much time, but I think it was concerning for us. We had a panel of peers to look at the plans, and I think they came away generally concerned that the plans were not that specific about what they were going to do.
Okay, so as you know, I've been moonlighting on AEI, and I hope no one watches this, so people don't know that I've been moonlighting, working on the side on the Maryland State Board of Education. So in full disclosure, I've been actually working on these issues at the state level. And so what I've seen over the past 2 years is just how difficult it is for states to work through these plans. So when Uncle Sam backs up, that means all of the things that he had been dictating to states on are now up for grabs again. So from the seat where I have been sitting for the past couple years, what I realize is when a state is given power again to debate what it means to be a great school, how you measure it, how you intervene. Do you value college going or career and technical education? How much weight do you put on whether English language learners are gaining or whether gifted kids are gaining? These are fundamental philosophical questions, and they don't always lend themselves to being answered simply in a document. So an argument that I've been making is maybe the process that states have gone through, it's been valuable, maybe not neat and tidy, but it's effectively states taking ownership of their K-12 education system again. Am I off base? You can say yes.
I don't want to say yes or no at this point. Like I would say, based on what we've said, like we felt like the plans were important enough to review.
Yep.
The states never have to go back in and get new approval. These approvals are permanent, and they are for a fairly large chunk of money. Maybe not from a state budget perspective, but from the federal government, it's their investment, the federal government's investment in low-income kids.
So we're talking billions of dollars. And to your point, it's the one time the feds will review this until presumably the law gets reauthorized, which could be 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years.
Yeah. And so there could be some of what you're saying that states are still either figuring out or they didn't want to put it in their formal plans for whatever reason. Maybe they have political realities in their state. Maybe they just didn't want to be held accountable. They wanted some flexibility in the back end. All those are legit. I would say that like the opposite interpretation is that like as scrutiny goes down, if the federal government's no longer looking, if groups like ours aren't looking anymore, are they going to have the ability to make tough decisions going forward? And I am concerned that some states won't have that capacity or willingness to make like hard decisions.
Okay, well, let's wrap things up with like a two-part question. One is simply looking back and one looking forward. So as you now take stock, we're sitting at the beginning of 2018, over the past almost 2 decades of increasingly forward-leaning Uncle Sam's behavior. What kind of lessons should people take away from that as we start to think about the ESSA era? What were the good things and what were the bad things, in sum?
Yeah, I think I would go back to this conversation about how to use the federal government's tools for good and what are the potential ramifications for different policies. I hope we don't go back to like a formal rules-based system like No Child Left Behind, but I am worried about what states don't do with their flexibility, and so like what happens next. I think it's useful for the states. I think it's useful for all of us to think about how that could work. I hope people will go back and reread our old paper, and maybe we didn't have the right balance, but
maybe not.
That sort of idea. I think we weren't wrong. I think we were early, if you will.
We should do like a vinyl reissue of this. Maybe it like become hot later on. So just looking forward, last question. If you, and you should be a state chief someday, if you get to be in charge of if you were in charge of a state right now with this new ESSA opportunity, where we have these lessons from the past decade and a half or more, and this new opportunity for states to do even more, based on what you've seen over the past 2 years, what states are doing so far, how would you nudge, encourage, incentivize a state to do more, and what are those things that you would encourage them to do?
The biggest thing for me is not using the data-driven accountability as the end-all be-all. So I think it should be sort of like a flag and investigation for further look at those schools. Say, this school has low-performing outcomes. Let's go take a look at it. Let's go review it. Have some external parties go look at it, as opposed to this is like below our set threshold and automatically something happens. I'd rather have more of a fuzzy process to say, here's a rough identification of, here's some schools we think need some help, and then what happens to them afterwards.
That's great. Well, thank you for your work for the federal government, now in the nonprofit sector, and this Herculean effort of reviewing these 51 state plans. I can only imagine how many hours it was. It was
a long. I'm glad to be done with it, I think. Yeah.
Well, you did a public service. Chad Aldeman, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with Chad Aldeman. Thanks so much for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint, and to learn more about the balance between federal and state power in schools, check the links in the description below.